Hi, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Aidan Flax Clark. I'm the Associate Director for Public Programs at the New York Public Library, and I get to introduce tonight's conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Barton Gellman, which is about his new book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the Surveillance State. And he'll be speaking about the book with Emily Bell, the founding director of the Toe Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. Bart's book in part chronicles his role, along with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, in receiving the vast trove of classified information that was leaked by Edward Snowden, but it also documents the continuing erosion of our rights to privacy, as well as the continuing enlargement of what our government deems acceptable as treatment of American citizens and our civil liberties. The book is available for sale from the library shop, which you can get to at nypl.org/shop. All of the proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. So again, you can go to nypl.org/shop and purchase Bart's new book. A couple of quick notes, and then I'm going to get out of your way. First of all, tonight's event is being simulcast on Zoom and on YouTube. If you are watching it on Zoom, the event is being recorded there, but only the event, not you, speaking of your privacy rights. So what you see on the screen is being recorded, nothing else. Bart would love to answer some of your questions tonight, and he wanted to make clear that he's ready to answer any difficult questions you have. So anything you'd like to ask, type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom app, and we will make sure that he sees them, and he will answer as many of them as he's able. Okay, so let's bring on Emily Bell and Bart Gellman and get right to it. Again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Here's one.
Hi, good evening.
And here's soon to come another. All right, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Aidan. I'm Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Toe Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. Bart, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. And thank you, Aidan, for that.
Yes, Bart, I was just thinking, we're on June the 11th, 2020. I'm wondering, can you remember what you were doing exactly 7 years ago?
June 11th. Yeah, I was frantically working my way through a much too large pile of classified material that I'd got from a source I had known only as Virax up to several days before that. I now knew it was Edward Snowden, and I had by then already written the first story or two of what would become a year-long series of stories about the NSA. And I was still quite overwhelmed, I would say.
It's because I was just remembering that Snowden himself, who none of us knew, self-disclosed on, I think, June the 9th. So we were, as you say, just 2 days into that. And I have to say, as somebody who's taught this in a journalism school, my background was a journalist at The Guardian, so I knew a lot of the characters who were involved in The Guardian side. What a huge story it was, what a huge impact it had. But this book that you're bringing out now, and I'm going to ask you in a minute, you know, why wait so long? Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. It really does two things that I think nobody else has done so well in the many, many thousands of words that have been written about this. One of which is the way that you lay out the journalistic process. And the other is the way that you really elucidate very complex matters of surveillance and make them real for people. You know, that this was not so you were sorting through all these classified documents. None of these issues at the time felt like perhaps people were even going to kind of engage with how important they were. Were you worried at any point as a journalist who'd been working for months and months on these disclosures? Were you worried that people just weren't going to get it at any point?
I worried about that all the time. I wasn't worried about whether I could elicit a particular reaction or a particular political point of view. I really am in my bones an old-fashioned, mainstream media reporter. There are values in my stories. There's news that I think is important. I want people to notice it. But I wasn't trying to elicit horror or anger. I was trying to bring to light something that's complicated and hard to understand and that I thought was important. And I didn't always feel equal to telling this story in a way that made sense in old-fashioned analog terms. And that's actually a big reason why I wrote the book, was I was dissatisfied with the daily newspaper stories and felt that I needed room for a narrative with characters and events and sort of the voice that you can take in a book in order to get this story across.
You certainly managed that, and as I say, it's a story that I feel like I know very well, and yet there were new things on every single page, and it's so beautifully told. Take us right back. You must be so. This must be something you can always do in your sleep. Is tell us the origins of this, because it has been a while for people who haven't been engaged with the facts of it. But how did you first encounter this story, and when did you know that there was something truly sort of important and verifiable here?
Well, in January of 2013, we now know, reconstructing events, Edward Snowden, who had been frustrated by his inability to reach Glenn Greenwald. Glenn hadn't answered his emails and didn't know how to use the encryption that Snowden required in order to communicate. Snowden then turned to the filmmaker, Laura Poitras. Laura and I were acquainted. We had been fellows at the same place at NYU. And I had previously advised Laura on how to encrypt her own personal materials so that they wouldn't be taken freely by inspectors at the border, which was happening. Laura wrote to me in January in an encrypted message and said, I'm going to be passing through town. Can we have a coffee? There's something I need to talk to you about. And in subsequent emails, she made it clear that she would like me not to bring my cell phone with me. And she'd like the place to be very quiet, very discreet. She said that she had been contacted by someone who called himself Virax, truth teller in Latin, and claimed to be a member of the intelligence community, and said that he had a story about surveillance that was so broad and so deep that it was a threat to the Republic. And my first unspoken reaction was, oh no, not that again. Because you get a lot of false tips as a reporter, and especially there's something about the spooky world of national security and intelligence that draws out disturbed people who imagine plots. And fraudsters. I had been given quite sophisticated fake documents in the past, and again after the Snowden story began. So I was very suspicious to begin with.
And there's a wonderful part in the book where you're describing that first meeting with Laura, who was a great journalist. But as you say, sort of, it's like you went to a quiet coffee spot, and it's like, this is not quite enough. We have to go to another one. To some extent, I think it's so interesting that the sort of cliche of the investigative journalist is meeting a shadowy figure on a bridge outside somewhere and passing notes over. But it's interesting that you and Laura are both really versed in the issues of surveillance. So she'd been certainly on the rough end of it as a documentarian, as a reporter. Were you constantly thinking at the time, as a national security reporter, that you were being watched or followed, or did you think that this was a slightly sort of too paranoid level of security?
I did not think that Laura was paranoid, or that she would lightly or trivially ask for special precautions. I assumed that she had reason to be cautious, and she did. She was using anonymous proxies and encrypted channels to talk to her source, and she wanted to consult very privately about it, and it made good sense. I mean, for most of 10 years by then, I had been gradually more convinced that I had to cover my digital tracks in my work, because it was all well and good to say as a newspaper reporter, as I was at the time, that I'm going to protect the confidentiality of my sources. But if we're leaving our names and addresses in our digital exhaust, if we're leaving traces all over the internet, that doesn't do much good. And so I had become proficient in the basic tools of privacy and security on the web.
And I think it's fair to say that actually you were one of only a really very small number of journalists who regularly practiced that at the time. And after the story broke, everybody had a PGP key. Everybody suddenly started to understand.
It's much more common now. You're right.
Right. So it really did. I think that certainly for the fields of journalism, Snowden changed a huge amount, almost immediately in terms of practice. So tell us a little bit about you were introduced via Laura to Verax. I'm always intrigued by how often these characters borrow from classical references to identify themselves. But you had no idea exactly who Edward Snowden was for quite some time. Is that right?
Right. So I had an extensive correspondence with him. Some of it was by email, asynchronous, in other words, and some of it was live, using live chat over encrypted channels. And we exchanged, I don't know, it had to be tens of thousands of words of back and forth, in which he was trying to work out in his own mind whether he could trust me enough to give me the story. And I was trying to figure out whether he was authentic, whether the story was real. He said that there was going to be a document. We never talked about a lot of documents. He kept talking about one.
Right.
You can imagine my surprise. But I cross-examined him closely about the provenance of the document, what it would say, who authored it, what their qualifications were to speak to what was happening inside the NSA, whether the document was not only authentic, but also accurate. There are two different things. I mean, I'd like to point out that there was an authentic headline in the Chicago paper in 1948 that said that Dewey defeats Truman, but it was the other guy who took the oath of office. So I wanted to know, is it a real document, and is the content of the document correct? And what would the government say when it learned that I had this document? What damage would it allege would ensue from publication, and so on? It went back and forth, sort of in endless iterations before I actually saw the thing.
So tell us about when you actually saw the thing. So it arrived, as you say, tens of thousands of words in. I'm going to go back in a little bit to talk a bit more about that getting to know a source, but just to keep us on track for the chronology, describe the moment that you open your encrypted mail and discover there's a document. Right.
So from January, when I first talked to Laura about this mysterious source of hers, it's now turned to May. Right. It's the third week of May, I want to say, and the document arrives. We decrypt it. It's a 41-page slide deck, a PowerPoint presentation about a program called Prism. And Laura and I read through this, sort of standing over the same tiny little crappy laptop screen, because we were using a burner laptop. And we read through it, and it had, as I say, 41 slides, but it had 7,000 words of speaker's notes. And this was written by insiders for insiders. Nothing was explained. All kinds of acronyms were used in passing and never decoded. There were literally code names, cryptonyms for the programs that were referred to, also without explanation. There was a lot of highly technical network jargon. And in other words, it was not a document that you could read it once and say, aha, I understand what's going on here.
It's also the case that for people who are not quite so familiar with your work, that maybe unlike unlike Laura and Glenn Greenwald at The Guardian at the time, who had a deep interest in these stories, you actually had a deep sort of expertise, if you like, in the national security apparatus. So in other words, if anyone was going to receive this who really understood those acronyms or who was speaking and why, it was going to be you. And yet, even to you, it was obscure or opaque. I sort of wondered whether, to what extent were you surprised? Because I think sometimes when journalists are expert in an area, you sometimes, speculate, you have a narrative speculation about, I wonder if they're doing this kind of thing, what would it look like if they were? But it sounds, from what you were saying and also from your description in the book, that this was genuinely something which you had not expected to see.
Well, I try really hard now as my career advances not to be surprised when I find out I don't know something, because it happens all the time. And the worst is when I imagine I do know it all, that I get the worst surprises. But look, this thing was unique. It was a code word classified document. I mean, it was classified above top secret, quote unquote. And it was contemporary. It was dated just a matter of days, weeks before I read it. And it described an extraordinarily sensitive, ongoing US intelligence gathering program. That alone was a shock to the system. It was not shocking to me that I didn't understand the shop talk of technical people who do highly technical things and have internal names for systems of enormous complexity and sophistication. I understood surveillance policy, surveillance law. I knew the history of the unlawful warrantless domestic surveillance that was undertaken by the Bush-Cheney administration 10 years before. But I did not imagine I knew all there was to know about how the NSA worked. That's been a black box for a long time.
And so you were saying, you received the first document, which was a 41-page PowerPoint presentations. Somebody said when it was published that you knew it was authentic because only something like a security agency could produce such an ugly set of slides. It had the whiff of authenticity about it. But then something sort of truly remarkable happened after your first document, which was that, to put it mildly, you received more.
I received more, right. So the next day, the day after the first document appeared, and I'm still trying to grapple with that. I understand maybe half of it, and I'm trying to work out, how do I come to understand the rest of it? I can't do what I normally do, which is to start showing it around widely and asking experts to explain it to me, because the people who would know aren't allowed to talk to me. And if they are willing to talk to me, I'd be putting them at risk by blundering around, calling them and so forth. So I have to go and visit people at home and have to study some background reading and so on. But now while I'm still just trying to get my arms around the first document, the next one arrives, and more particularly, the encryption key arrives for very large digital encrypted files that, for all we knew, were garbage. They might have been something valuable or important, or it might have just been noise. The encryption keys arrive. It's one encrypted volume inside a second, inside a third. It's like Russian dolls of encryption. And we open the last of them, and there are folder after folder after folder and subfolder of classified documents. And I started clicking through at random, and I was truly overwhelmed. I felt, that something very big had just happened, that I was very fortunate to be at this journalistic moment. And there was all kinds of risks now that I realized right away I was going to have to start contending with. I knew just from reading the first document that there were things in this archive that I did not think should be published. And in fact, Snowden did not think should be published. And I was going to have to protect those. I was going to have to try to make sure that nobody stole them from me. I was going to need big time legal advice. I was going to need some journalistic help with the scale of this thing. There were 50,000 plus documents. And I was a freelancer. I was a fellow at the Century Foundation, which is a wonderful public policy shop. And I have great colleagues there, but it's not a journalistic enterprise. And I badly needed to find my way to back to the sort of news media that I'd grown up in.
And I think that sort of when I talk about laying out the journalistic process of this is for those of us who are news nerds, it's a fascinating challenge when somebody drops a thumb drive or sends you an encrypted key, and there are 50,000 documents on the back end of it, which, as you say, kind of you start to think you actually need a big institution behind you.
But somebody does that. It never happens. I mean, the idea that you wake up one day and you either get a phone call out of the blue or a box of documents arrives out of the blue you weren't expecting, and it's got some stupendous scoop in it. That just doesn't happen. That's a movie cliche, but that's not the way scoops come. We could talk about that, but yeah, this was sui generis.
Yes, and I think it certainly ignited many suspicions. Again, it had that fringe kind of conspiracy. It sort of invited conspiracy theories into the story, which is, this is too good to be true or too bad to be true. This feels like a setup. It's too kind of clean and thought out, and it doesn't really happen like this in real life. And talking of the movies, you ended up going back to actually your alma mater in a way, the Washington Post, with Hollywood's Marty Baron, who viewers will be familiar with him from hits such as Spotlight. But Marty was sort of the editor, and again, it's very interesting in the book. Just as a reporter with a huge scoop, you would think that any editor would just throw themselves at it and say, yes, come on in. But there are lots of reasons why it was a risk, wasn't it, taking it to a newspaper? What are the kinds of things that you had to negotiate with the Post, and where?
So Marty Baron was the editor. He had been editor for less than a year at that stage. I had spent 21 years at the Washington Post and left several years before this moment. I wanted to go back and invite him to help me with this story, invite him to sponsor this story. And I had a whole long list of crazy sounding conditions. So I wasn't an employee, and I wasn't under his authority. I was asking for his sponsorship, but I was already deeply aware of how sensitive this material was. So I said, we can't communicate about this story in the normal way, that there were going to have to be a couple of editors and reporters at least at the newspaper who would learn how to communicate over encrypted channels, that I was not going to hand over this document. I spoke to him just about one document on our first meeting, that I would be happy to show it to him, but that I was not going to transfer to the paper's possession any part of it that I thought should not be published. That if we were going to work with material like this, the people who worked on it would have to have computers that were physically doctored to remove their networking hardware, so they could not accidentally touch the internet or be touched by hackers. That we were going to have to keep the material in a locked room, in a safe. There was a whole list of security precautions, and there were hard legal questions that had to be answered about risk. There was a certainty that there would be a criminal investigation, that someone would be charged, that my source eventually would be found and charged with espionage for this leak. And it was probable that I would be summoned to a grand jury to testify and to provide documentation. And I was not going to do that voluntarily. And so I wanted the Post to commit to representing me, at trial and all the way through final levels of appeal, which the Post did undertake. There was also a smaller possibility that I or the Post itself could be charged with espionage just for publishing. That charge had never been brought against a journalist before. And it was unclear whether it would be constitutional to do so, but the lawyers did not want to rule it out in a case of this sensitivity. So I had a lot to talk about with Marty. And the last thing was, I wanted him to hold a backup copy of the materials I had. I had made an extra encrypted copy of this whole archive. And I was very much worried about losing it. I was worried about an FBI raid or someone coming to steal it. I was afraid of losing my only copy. And there's a dearth of obvious places to hide something that valuable. And I wanted the Post to hold it because I thought that it would be a lot easier to stage a raid on a freelance guy who in his apartment than it would be to break down the doors of a newsroom. So I said to Marty, I'd like you to hold this. He's not going to have the encryption key. He's not going to be able to open it, but I'd just like you to hold it. And the Washington Post lawyer said, Marty, as the paper's lawyer, I can't advise you to do that. And Marty took about 2 seconds to decide, I'm going to do it. And he did. And it was an enormous relief to me. It felt like the Washington Post was still the great paper I'd grown up with, and that I was being welcomed home.
I think that was a really sort of remarkable kind of moment, because again, from the outside, I think that there's sometimes a public perception that these things, if you have a great story, it happens very easily in newsrooms. And just like the perfect scoop, that is never the case. There's always sort of stumbling blocks, and it's also why you need great editors. Just sort of going back though to this, so let's talk again about Snowden as the source. So up to this point, you still don't really know anything about him. You guessed that maybe he might be an older person, or you haven't sort of, he has to reveal himself to you as a source over that period of months. There's a really interesting sort of dilemma here, I think, for particularly a journalist working on this particular story where espionage is a potential charge, which is you both have to know this, you have to feel that you know the source well enough to trust them, but you also can't be an accomplice. That's a very important distinction, isn't it, in terms of both journalistic practice and the law. So sort of tell us about how your relationship and knowledge of Snowden evolved throughout that time, and how did you balance that really tricky, I think, relationship with the source of enough knowledge but no complicity?
It's so interesting that you use the term accomplice, because that's the exact word that was used to describe me by the Director of National Intelligence in congressional testimony at the very beginning of 2014. He referred to the three journalists, Glenn and Laura and me, as Snowden's accomplices, which has a meaning in law, and alarmed me, I have to say, to hear him say that, because it was sort of vetted congressional testimony. It wasn't something that he had just come up with out of the blue. He had prepared those remarks in advance and had them cleared around the U.S. agencies. And so the U.S. government was calling me an accomplice. And it was something that I took care not to be. For example, if he said, I'm thinking of breaking into the NSA and stealing some documents, can you help me? I've got a little math problem here that I'm having trouble solving, or I don't know the password, or whatever else it might be. First of all, no, I wouldn't be capable of helping him. But the important thing is that I wouldn't help him, that I couldn't be party to breaking in. There's a clear legal distinction there. It is not trafficking in stolen goods or unlawful in any way for a journalist to publish something that a source has taken unlawfully. But the journalist can't participate in the theft. And Snowden didn't ask me to do that. He did, however, ask me very indirectly to assist him with his plans for getting asylum from a foreign country. He asked me to do something that would have no purpose for readers, no other purpose than to help him introduce himself as authentic to foreign government officials. And I declined to do that.
and tell again, just tell us how. When did you know that he was actually a 29-year-old security analyst with few academic qualifications, clearly a kind of extraordinary person in other ways. But how, what was that sort of process of discovery like?
Well, it was constrained. Snowden, well, let's say it this way, Virax revealed his identity on the day that the large cache of documents arrived. That large set of documents, that archive, was accompanied by a sort of manifesto in which he explained his purposes and his beliefs. I quote this manifesto at some length in the book. And at the bottom of it, it said, Edward Joseph Snowden, here's my social security number, here's my CIA employee number, here are my credentials. It did not have his date of birth, which was interesting. And Laura and I did not feel free at that stage. Now, we have all these secrets and we're planning to write stories. And in particular, one story together, Laura and me. But we haven't published yet. And we don't want the government to know we have this stuff yet. We need to sort it out for a while first. And I was afraid that if I started Googling, Edward Snowden, or looking him up by social security number in some database, which is how I would find out his age and other pertinent things about him, that I could be giving away the game. That if the government already suspected that I was working on something like this or had caught wind of a leak of this kind, somebody could be watching. And I did not want to out him as my source either. So I just sort of felt like I didn't know what was fair game. I didn't know what could be seen and not seen. And so I didn't do any research on the guy for a while. I had asked him a lot of questions myself, but I did not feel free to do that.
That's an extraordinary, again, it all seems, because we're all so familiar now, I think, with him as an icon, and I was very kind of, something I didn't know was actually a lot of the iconic images we see of Snowden were actually taken by you from meeting with him in Russia. I didn't realize that you had photography. It was another talent to your bow. But we feel that we actually know him very well. He's been very generous with his insights and profile as a source. But so thinking back to really you being in a tunnel of a sort of real cone of silence in terms of not wanting to give the game away, tip your hand, put him in danger, etc. So when you actually sort of found out who he was, I mean, that was really kind of the documents, publication, disclosure, all happened in a really very short space of time after quite a long period of back and forth and establishing credentials. Did it change how you felt about Snowden when you found out that he was 29? Because it feels, I spoke to Ewan McCaskill about this, who's the Guardian journalist who was sent out to sort of establish whether it's sort of his bona fides, and you and I remember sort of saying, kind of very movingly, he's the same age as my son. He's a really young man. How did you feel when you discovered the details about him?
There were so many jaw-dropping things happening at once that I can't remember whether this sort of further astonished me, but I was surprised to learn he was so young. I had come to imagine who I was talking to. I'd never heard his voice or seen his image, but when you exchange tens of thousands of words with someone, a lot of them in live chat, so you could see his thoughts forming in real time. You can see it. It only took him 15 seconds to write that reply, and it's quite eloquent. I mean, he seemed to know a lot about a lot of things. He had a way of expressing himself that Laura and I had just come to assume that he was in his late middle age and a fairly senior person in the intelligence establishment. And so, yeah, I was quite surprised that he was young.
So I want to do just in the few minutes we have before we open it up for questions, and as Bart said, do pitch in some hard questions. I just wanted to talk about the other aspect of the book, which is really the sort of the unpacking of exactly what it means to live in a surveillance state, how America was operating a type of surveillance state covertly, how it alienated you from many of your sources in the national security apparatus. I mean, something that sort of that occurred to me as I was reading it is that how much has actually changed, or it feels like a great deal has changed in the past 7 years. Has it really? I mean, there are things, I think, you mentioned sort of popular culture was shifted by Snowden. What are the things that really changed once the disclosures were made? And do you think they were as a result of the story, or were they as a result of different external pressures?
So I think there are a lot of overlapping forces that bring about change, starting with Snowden, but he's got all these sort of knock-on effects. The disclosures that he made shifted public opinion, and that shifted political winds, and so Congress passed legislation that reformed some of the collection practices. In particular, Congress passed a law that forbade the NSA directly to collect records of all the telephone calls we were making. One of the shocking things, and big picture, the shocking part of the story was that after 9/11, the boundaries completely shifted. The permissible lines changed entirely, so that things that Americans had grown used to thinking that their government could not do, like spy on them, had changed. The lines shifted, and they shifted in secret, so that even the best informed citizen or public interest group or lobbyist, or in many cases members of Congress, even the best informed were unable to know what had happened. And so the shock was these things had changed in secret, and political pressures were brought to bear, and so Congress did put some restraint on the NSA after that. Those same citizens were also consumers, and they created demand for privacy and security in their digital lives. So companies who had no particular privacy model, there was nobody in the business of selling private and secure communications. It just wasn't something that was much in demand. People didn't have much consciousness of it. They took it for granted. But when the stories broke, and one in particular that I wrote, I think, made a big difference here. The story said that the NSA was going overseas and breaking into the private fiber optic cable links that connected data centers of Google and Yahoo and Microsoft overseas. So they have this gigantic global infrastructure, and a data center is something that would fill many, many city blocks. It has its own power plant and sort of an Indiana Jones style kind of warehouses full of servers. And these things are connected by thousands of miles of cable that are not the internet. They're privately owned by Google, say. The NSA was breaking into those links. And the internet companies went nuts. They were extremely surprised and distressed to learn that they were vulnerable in this way. And they then began to spend, because they were pressed by their customers, or their consumers, who wanted security and privacy, and in particular overseas, where almost all their growth was going to be. European countries, for example, were demanding privacy. So Google now spent tens of millions of dollars specifically to thwart the intelligence gathering capabilities of its own government. And Microsoft and Yahoo, which had been resisting encryption, suddenly started encrypting all its connections. And now, if you get online, it's easy to forget that 7 years ago, when you browsed around the web, you were not seeing a padlock icon in your browser bar for almost any site. Most of the internet, all the news sites, all the commerce sites, all the social networks This stuff was all unencrypted. It was all traveling naked data around the net. Now there's an encrypted link between your computer and the server that's serving you. And that makes it much harder for the NSA to make collection in bulk of high volumes of communications. NSA can still break into any particular link that it wants, but it can still surveil anyone, but it can't surveil everyone as easily as it used to.
It was a real revelation actually to me about your book. It was the first time that I think I was convinced, maybe I trust you too much, but the first time that I was actually convinced that Google and Yahoo really didn't know that this was happening, because in the stories at the time, I think there was a feeling of, kind of they're saying we're shocked. This is about we have no idea, but you lay out how actually kind of just showing how this was happening to somebody who worked for Google genuinely sort of elicited a shock, and it also made me think about how in 7 years. As you say, sort of privacy and our right to privacy has entered the language. But also in some ways, I just wondered whether you agreed with it, or what you thought about that balance of how people think about the state versus corporations. Because one of the outcomes of Snowden was that corporations tightened their security, and yet post 2016, and particularly Cambridge Analytica, sort of another kind of big story in 2017, the heat has really been on the big tech companies rather than the NSA. Are we sort of looking in the wrong place, or is this has the threat to our private security, privacy really sort of tipped in a way?
Well, yeah, I've been known to trip into the wrong rabbit hole from time to time. I think you don't need to choose between concern about privacy when it comes to government surveillance and concern about privacy when it comes to the commercial market for data, when it comes to the original sin of the internet, as that's a term I did not coin, but the idea that you would trade all the data about yourself for some service, that you're not actually the customer of most of these companies, that you're the product that's being sold to advertisers. That's a big problem, and it's just not the problem I was tackling in this book.
Right. And I just want to talk as well a little bit about something you get to at the end of the book, which is many of the things that Snowden's disclosures were aimed at stopping. And sort of a slide into authoritarianism, extrajudicial reach by the state. It's kind of happened anyway, but in ways that we could not have predicted back in 2013. And we've seen this sort of all over the world. There's been a real change in political temperature. Post-Trump, one of the points you make in the book is that all of this apparatus was assembled by the state on the grounds that everybody believed the state would behave ultimately in the best interest of its citizens. And in Trump, we have a case, perhaps, which suggests that might not be so. What does the NSA and the intelligence agencies, all of which have been sort of denigrated at one point or another by the president, now feel about the power that they have, or the power that they've potentially invested in perhaps an unstable actor?
So I wouldn't have predicted this. I found it fascinating that when I went around in the Trump era to talk to some of the senior national security officials who had been so angry at me because I wrote the Snowden stories, that their thinking had shifted a bit with passage of time. So James Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence and called me an accomplice, which meant I should be brought up on charges.
Criminal.
And by the way, still defends that language to this day, agreed to come meet me at a CIA hangout diner in Northern Virginia. And we sat down for what turned out to be a 3-hour breakfast. And I reproduced this conversation and this whole scene in the book. There are things he still defends absolutely the same as he always did. And he's certainly no fan of Snowden. But Snowden made one central point that Clapper found himself almost involuntarily beginning to get soft on. And Snowden's phrase was turnkey tyranny.
Right.
He said that some of the surveillance machinery was so powerful that it was risky even to build it, because you might trust one person to run it, but you might not trust the next. And Clapper didn't trust Trump. Clapper believed he was a threat to law, a threat to rule of law, a threat to sort of legal and political norms we had built up in this country. And he wasn't so sure he wanted a guy like that to have his hands on that apparatus.
So I'm going to go to Q&A though I want to try and insert some more of my own questions in here as well. There's a question here from Tali Stolzenberg-Myers saying, before you received the decryption keys for the second archive, what did you think was in that large file? Did Snowden explain what he intended to provide you before you received it?
Snowden was very good at dissimulation and deflection, and he would talk about what he wanted to talk about. And so we would start to ask questions about the file called architectural materials, and he would say it was a gigantic multi-gigabyte file of no known file type. And if I looked at it with a hex editor, it was just random characters. I had no idea what was in it, or whether anything was in it. And he gave us no preparation at all for the idea that there was going to be a large cache of documents all coming at once.
And another question which sort of follows up from that, really, which is, so the most troubling revelations from your perspective from the documents. So as you were going through them, you say that there was sort of jaw-dropping moment after jaw-dropping moment. If you had to pick out things, and I know that in the book you say there are stories that you thought were really important that you didn't get to at the time, and that's why you put them in the book. But if you look back and you think, what were the really troubling things in that cache, what would they be?
As time went on, I became most interested in, and I worked the hardest to delve into stories about the impact of NSA operations overseas on domestic U.S. privacy. That the whole conceptual architecture of the NSA, which is that when you're spying overseas, you're spying on foreigners, that was no longer true. The internet destroyed that, because the internet doesn't respect sovereign borders in any way. An email from the east side to the west side of New York is going to pass through Ireland, and almost certainly, because Google has a large data operation there, and it uses globalized load balancing and backups, and internet content gets broken up into tiny little packets and take their separate ways around the internet and so on. And so basically, if you dip into some big high volume pipe of data overseas, you're going to find Americans in it. And the NSA handles that by saying that, well, if you collect any Americans that way, that's incidental to our purpose, which means we didn't do it on purpose. But it doesn't mean accidental. It doesn't mean inadvertent. It doesn't mean unwelcome. And so huge volumes of US communications are being scooped up in the course of targeting foreigners overseas. And the rules about how that data is treated are infinitely complex, and in my own view as a citizen, inadequate to protect privacy.
There's actually a sort of great question here, which is a hard question. And the question reads, I wonder if the Washington Post would agree now to such a story, as it's owned by Jeff Bezos, whose company Amazon has business ties with the intelligence agency of the US government. I think that's a good question. I kind of almost might sort of phrase that as well, which is, would you go to the Post now with those, given that there's been a change of ownership?
Well, look, when Bezos bought the Washington Post, I was simultaneously very happy for the paper that it was going to have some financial backing, and very worried, because let's face it, I mean, rich people don't usually buy toys without wanting to play with them. And I worried that he would play with it too much. And I am not an employee of the Washington Post. I have no direct stake in this. I have no constraint on what I'm able to say about this. Everything I know from talking to sort of working levels at the Washington Post in the newsroom and talking to the top brass tells me that he has not interfered in any way. If I checked it out and I got a report like that, then yes, I would go to the Post with a story. I have no doubt in my own mind that Bezos would publish these stories. When he came in, it was partway through the reporting and publishing of these stories, and he did publish these stories. In fact, he hosted a small dinner for the people who were the key people doing the coverage on these stories to celebrate the work. So yes, he would.
So another hard question. You're doing very well, the audience members. Saying, what are Mr. Gellman's thoughts on the price of Julian Assange waiting an extradition trial in England and the implications for other investigative journalists of this case? I think sort of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden often, because of very, if you like, the sort of the architecture of whistleblowing, leaking, etc. This is a question that's often linked. How do you see that question?
There's so many levels to it. So Assange and Snowden are very different, even though they come from, to some extent, the same world. Snowden does not approve everything that Assange did or everything that WikiLeaks did. And in fact, the handle he chose was a little bit of a tweak at Assange, because Assange in his youth as a hacker, had adopted the handle Mendax, which basically means liar. And Snowden's Virax meant the opposite. He did not want the documents that he stole to be made public in their entirety on the web. If Snowden wanted that, he'd have given them to WikiLeaks. And in fact, Julian Assange was very angry at Snowden for not giving them to WikiLeaks. Snowden knew how to work the internet. He could have published everything. He wanted journalists to sift through them, select among them, and perform the filtering and editorial roles that journalists traditionally performed. That's the opposite of what Assange wanted when it came to data. Nevertheless, I am extremely troubled by one aspect, at least, of the case United States against Julian Assange. That is that in three of the charges, three of the counts of the indictment against him, the crime consists of publication. It literally, that's the words of the charge, that he violated the Espionage Act by publishing for all the world to see the following document. Now, that claim has never been brought against anyone. It's not to say that I want to take a part in whether or not Julian Assange is a journalist. Journalists don't have any special First Amendment rights, actually. Everyone has them. But what Assange has been charged with here has never been charged against anyone ever. And if he's convicted and the conviction is upheld of espionage for publication, then the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and BuzzFeed and everyone else who writes about secret things in the world of national security is going to be exactly equally at risk.
This is a very broad question, but one I'm interested in the answer to, which is, what made you decide to become a journalist?
The smart-ass answer is because I was a very bad junior varsity gymnast in high school. And so I quit the team and went to work for the paper. And there's a long story in this, but the short one is that I became editor of the high school newspaper. The principal didn't like something that we were printing, and she seized all the copies and burned them. And I brought a First Amendment lawsuit in federal court. And so I was fairly well committed early on to giving a crap about this sort of thing. And so one thing led to another, and I've Now it's the college paper and the summer internships, and it all seemed very natural to keep going.
It's you clearly a perfect student. People, I can only imagine the principals, like, you know, reaction to that. There's actually
She was
just
rather
something.
frightening, I must say.
But yes, I can imagine. So we have a few more questions. I think there's time. So this is, again, now you and I both have a number of children. Those are all, I think, sort of more like young adults these days. But how can parents of young children, digital natives, introduce the idea of privacy to their naive children?
So the thing is, I think in age-appropriate ways, it's not as hard as you would think to do that, because children learn relatively early on that some things are private and some things aren't, and they have their own secrets. Or let's say you get into the age of teenagers. A lot of people think teenagers, oh, they'll post anything on Instagram. We're used to say it about Facebook, or they just give it all away. They say things in public that we would never have said. Us old fuddy-duddies. Well, the fact is that high school and college students have lots of secrets, and they want control over who knows what. And first of all, they try to use the privacy controls in these apps, but they're not very good at it because they're designed to be hard to use. They're designed actually to be impossible to use. And also they're speaking in code. They'll be quoting song lyrics so that their parents or their principal don't know what they're saying, but all their friends do. But there are absolutely things that they want to keep private, or they want control. They want to control whether this friend or that friend knows, whether their parents know, whether the teachers know. They absolutely do have a sense of privacy. The important thing is to teach them how, without knowing it, their privacy can be violated. So, I mean, I've taught my own kids to limit the information that they provide and the software they download. And, I ask them to use more privacy protecting software or services. For example, I mean, use DuckDuckGo instead of Google, because it's a search engine that doesn't spy on you.
Right. And it's I found that the words when they're about 13 or 14, which is, that snaps don't really disappear, is very powerful. They have a discussion about
that was a
where
revelation.
do they go. Yeah, I've never seen a 14-year-old boy's face pale quite so quickly as when I said, well, they're sitting on their servers somewhere. This is actually, as I say, we've just got time for a couple more questions. These are questions that I would really like to know, which is, and you may not want to disclose this, do you still have access to the documents? Does the Post still have access to the documents? And do you think there are more stories in there that should be reported, or is the rest legitimately secret?
There are limits to how much I'm going to answer that question. But I still could have access to the documents, but they're in cold storage, which means they're even more deeply protected than before, and they're not set up in such a way that I can get at them quickly. The Post no longer has access to them. We're no longer actively working on stories. I'm not saying that everything left in there is a deep, dark secret. A lot of it is just bureaucratic and technical, and would be pointless and possibly damaging to reveal. I was interested in stories that raised hard public policy questions. Should they be allowed to do this? What are the boundaries between government and its own citizens? Do we understand the implications of that program, and so on? But just 10,000 pages of network maps or budget documents, there's a lot in there that would be just boring. And there are a lot of things in there that I think should not be published because they would give away ongoing operations against adversaries that anyone would regard as a legitimate intelligence target if they believed in intelligence at all. If you accept that governments need secret intelligence for some purposes, sometimes these would qualify. And I'm not going to publish something that blows an operation like that.
So, and we just have one more minute to go before we wrap up. I just want to ask you about Edward Snowden himself. Are you still in touch with Edward, and have you seen him recently?
I haven't visited him in Moscow for several years now. I went to see him twice, and I did video chat with him when we talked about less sensitive subjects. He's gradually loosened up so that he was willing to do video. I tell the story in the book. I show the story scene by scene of when he agreed to come with me virtually and meet the cast of the TV series Homeland and talk about real world spy things with them. So I've had these kind of interactions with him and some not long ago, but we're not in touch all the time.
Mm-hmm. He got Claire Danes to delay her flight, so that's something. So we are up to time, but I would say, please, first of all, thank you very much, Bart. You've been terrifically insightful on this. Secondly, if you're interested in any of these issues, please buy the book. It's a really, really great read. Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. And I hope that everybody stays safe and everybody stays cool. And don't forget to encrypt your communications and have, I hope, a safe and happy summer. And thanks very much indeed for the team at the New York Public Library for hosting this.
Thank you, Emily. I'm glad you did it. And thanks also from me to the library. This has been a great event. Thanks.